Thank you. Thank you for having me. So today I wanted to talk about PACs versus lone wolf newsrooms. And when I went from PACE to the Center for Collaborative Journalism, I definitely went from a PAC-oriented newsroom to a couple of lone wolf-oriented newsrooms. And I've tried to move the latter to the former, because I think it's important. Collaboration is more than just the word in the title of my organization. It's something that I think is vital to our survival of what we do as journalists. As our dearly departed Edward Stark has pointed out, when things get really tough, the lone wolf dies, but the pack survives. And I think it's vital for morale in our newsrooms, which have taken a beating, obviously. It's important for our brand. And we hear a lot of talk about monetization, the problems that's causing for our newsrooms. I think the fundamental problem we have is a brand problem. The whole value proposition has fallen apart for consumers and for advertisers. And so if they don't value what we do, then there's no way to monetize that. There's no clever scheme we're going to come up with. So we need to restore our brand, people's perceptions of what we do and why it's valuable. And ultimately the impact, which is obviously why we do what we do. We want to have impact. We want our stories to be read or watched, and we want people to take action. And collaboration can enhance all of those. And when I talk about collaboration, we're talking across newsrooms, as we do at the Center for Collaborative Journalism, within the community, both your audience and readers, and maybe other organizations within your community, nonprofits, NGOs, things like that. And within the newsroom, which is where I'm going to spend most of my focus today. So we started PACE in 2012 with a couple friends, and we relatively quickly became the third largest music magazine just from bootstrapping it with our credit card. We were a music magazine that also covered other areas of entertainment, targeted at adults at a time when most of the music magazines were either really small and niche, or they were targeting teens with rotating covers of Christina Aguilera, Britney Spears, and Justin Timberlake, half naked. That was sort of the standard newsstand covers. And so we came out targeting sort of a New Yorker, NPR, young audience, and it just took off. And it was a very young, collaborative newsrooms, and I think we did great work. We were more substantive, I think, than most of our peers, and we were awarded with 3 consecutive National Magazine Award nominations for General Excellence, which is the highest award you can get. We were the only music title to ever do that in NMA history. And so it was a great run. We were a print magazine. We had a CD in it, and we stopped printing in 2010, 2011, sold the company right before that. And I stayed on for a year, and then deciding what I wanted to do next was getting ready to get an apartment in Brooklyn, work for Condé Nast, when Mercer called and said, instead of New York, why don't you come down to little Macon and help us start this thing? And I never thought I would go from, I was trying to get out of Atlanta because it was too small. And now I'm in the small community of Macon. But I really loved the idea behind the center. Knight had funded it. We're one of the 8 Knight communities. And they wanted us to do the teaching hospital model. So the daily newspaper there, which was a McClatchy newspaper, about 25 years older than the New York Times, moved their entire newsroom to our building, public radio stations there, and then we added a TV station a year and a half ago. And the idea is to train students by putting them in newsrooms. And so that sounds very collaborative, but I went from this young environment, dynamic, to this. And this was a big improvement over where they were. They were in this cavernous building that was leaking and much more empty than that is. But it was a very quiet newsroom. And I've had lots of visitors come visit, and they say, I've seen quiet newsrooms, but you're among the top. And that does not necessarily foster collaboration. So I knew I had my challenge cut out for me. So let me talk a little bit about some of the things we did at PACE that were collaborative and some of the benefits of that, and then I'll transition into what we actually did in a news environment, a traditional news environment. So this top one here, Evolution of the Hipster, was a collaboration with our editorial team and our graphics designer, and we kind of had a reputation of being a little staid, a little too serious for a music magazine especially. And so we were constantly trying to do things to shake it up. And so they came up with this idea, came out in the December issue. Someone scanned it and put it online before we could, and it started taking off, so we quickly put it online, and it became our equivalent of the dialect quiz for the New York Times. It went online in December, and that year it drove 20 to 25% of our web traffic of only being up for like 3 weeks. So that kind of lit some light bulbs about the power of viral content and getting stuff online timely. If you've read much music journalism, you know there are a lot of tropes and cliches that tend to come into it. As with a lot of feature articles, you go to meet your subject, you're in a hotel, you have a nice salad, and that becomes the setting for the story, and it's very boring. And after years of profiling musicians, even a good writer, sometimes that just gets boring where you're delving into their process and how many different ways can you do that. So the editorial team got together and said, well, how can we do something different for this new Death Cab album? And we knew that Ben Gibbard was a fan of Jack Kerouac, so we said, well, Ben, why don't you go out to Big Sur, lock yourself in a cabin for days, and reflect on Kerouac and write about the process and how your new album relates to that. And he surprisingly went for it. And so he wrote his own cover story reflecting on his artistic process. And obviously fans loved that, and I think it was a valuable look at an artist. We also tried to do a number of themes, issues. So we did one on violence, where we had everything from a quiz, was it Cash Money or Johnny Cash, looking at violent lyrics in country versus rap, and sort of getting at why is it okay when Johnny Cash he talks about shooting a man in Reno just to watch him die, but if a hip-hop artist says that, there's all sorts of outroar. So delving into those kind of issues, looking at New Orleans and the violence that was caused by not only the hurricane, but failed policies and how that's devastated a music scene there. Veteran reporter John Richardson talked about a story he tried to pursue early on when he was a Cub reporter about a couple teenagers who gassed themselves, killed themselves in a car, and he got that off the police spotter and wanted to turn it into a big profile, and his editor refused him because he didn't want to sensationalize it and cause copycats. And so he goes into this long essay about what is our responsibility as journalists, as media, when it comes to violence. And so just an example of things that would not be done if we just had even our best great reporters out there as lone wolves pursuing ideas on their own. But it wasn't just the reporters that we had doing this. We tried to work across the organization. So you heard the unholy collaborators from earlier. We actually did a lot of that. So we tried to protect the editorial integrity, of course, but when it came to non-endemic advertisers, BMW was not going to influence our editorial content. We actually invited the editorial team into the brainstorming process. So BMW wanted a music activation package. We gave them one, and we were actually the first company ever to have their agency's print and digital team meet in the same room with a client, which I still find astounding. This was 2007 or 8, and everything was still separate. Our marketing director got together with our editorial team and came up with an idea for an indie rock alphabet book, their first book. Our tech team came up with this idea for a Harry Potter scavenger hunt. The movie was about to come out. We wanted to showcase what we could do for advertisers and also just drive engagement to the website. So we layered on top of the site a scavenger hunt where you had to answer questions about content, and then you would get this Harry Potter game that came up, and you would have to cast spells, so it tested your Harry Potter knowledge. And then the editorial team jumped on it and said, well, why don't we, for that one day, tie all of our content, or at least 90% of it, to something Harry Potter. So even if it's a tenuous connection, can we come up with some really interesting story ideas, some ways that Harry Potter relates to pop culture in ways that maybe people haven't thought of. And then we had a book club. We were reading Good to Great, a very popular business book, talking about interacting with customers and letting them getting a feedback mechanism. And on the day we were going through one of those chapters, Radiohead announced that they're going to drop their album for whatever you want to pay. First time anybody had done anything like that. So we're sitting in a group meeting talking about the chapter about customer feedback, and it said, well, here's a great feedback mechanism. What if we just completely ripped off Radiohead? And by the end of the week, we had this live. We were the first people to copy them. And so we had all kinds of media impressions around that and drove a lot of subscribers. We would have had to mail out 2 million direct mail pieces to get the subscribers we got off of that one thing that we did in a matter of 3 days. And then in terms of process, our editorial team had never heard of Scrum, had never heard of stand-ups, but they started doing their own stand-ups every morning. So if you don't know what a stand-up is, you get together every morning for 10 to 15 minutes, and you really time box it because no one has time for constant meetings. And I see that as a big problem in a lot of our newsrooms. And so they checked in on status and held each other accountable, and they drove that process. It wasn't something coming from management. And then we would get together. We did have meetings, but we had them intentionally and not too often. But after the end of every issue, we would have a postmortem to talk about what went well on this issue, what content did we like, what could have been better. In terms of process, what did we do well, what did we not do well? In terms of design, so we looked at the whole magazine as a whole company. So translating that to daily news can be challenging. Obviously, it's a little different when you're talking about music. It's a whole different vibe. It can be a lot more fun and obvious in ways to collaborate, but not so much when you come to newsrooms. Well, one of the things we had to do as part of our grant from the Knight Foundation are community engagement projects. We have to do those regularly. And Knight's idea is we want to change the way the media talks to the community. We want to change that relationship so it's not expert talking to a passive audience. And so, in sort of the lone wolf mentality that we were all in, we came in and started throwing out ideas, and we threw out what you would expect. Let's dig into this aspect of public education, which just sorely needs some spotlights. Let's dig into this aspect of health. Let's dig into this aspect of city government. And then we stepped back for a second and said, wait a minute, the whole idea of these projects is to really tap into what the community is passionate about, what it wants to know more about, and also to tap into its expertise. So for our first project, we should just go out in the community and talk to them. And let's find out, what are they passionate about? What are their concerns? What are their aspirations? How do they think their neighbors see their neighborhood? And so that's exactly what we did. So we had our students go out and interview nearly 700 residents. And we mapped it all out, so we were getting racial and ethnic and gender and economic diversity and hitting all geographic diversity in the community. And then the professionals came and tried to distill that. But rather than handing this piece off to a reporter and this piece off to a reporter, we were very collaborative in talking about how can we tell this story in a way that maximizes the impact. And so we ended up with our public radio reporter writing a newspaper piece about the concerns of the community, reflecting, digesting that. And one of my staff members wrote a piece about how the community, what its aspirations are, what is it proud of, how can we build on that. And through all those pieces, we had profiles of individual members of the community, people who had never seen themselves in the news before. And here they could open up the newspaper or turn on the radio, and here was a profile of an everyday citizen. And then one of the feature writers for the newspaper said, well, why don't I take a walk down Pionona, which is this corridor that's run through the community, a central hub dating back pre-Eisenhower interstate system. 5.3-mile stretch goes from ritzy residential to commercial to blighted commercial to rundown residential to industrial. And he walked the 5.3 miles over a couple days and talked to individual residents and business owners. And then over a 9-day series that this ran, he reflected the community's impressions of itself by telling this narrative of walking down Pionona. And that story came out and it had a huge impact. The community took note of what we were doing at the center, took note of what the Telegraph and GPB had invested, and became the talk around the water coolers. And we actually had third-party studies that show this actually shifted the community's perception of what we do. They felt like we were engaged in a different way, that we were listening and that we cared. And we won an AP award in Georgia for a Best Community Service piece. And then out of that, though, came our next project. One of the things that we were surprised to hear was how strongly blight resonated as an issue across the economic spectrum. We were not anticipating that. We were expecting to go into education or something like that. But that came out in town hall meetings and our interviews very strongly. And so we dug into blight. We spent a whole year digging into residential and commercial blight. And we've had actually a 9-day series and then another 5-day series on blight. And the county commissioners actually approved $14 million to fight blight as a result of our efforts. None of that would have happened without collaboration. And in terms of process, we still have a long ways to go in instituting a culture of collaboration, but the newsrooms actually shared budgets, which is actually a big step for them. And they share stories. The radio guys write for, and gals write for the newspaper, and the newspaper reporters are often on the radio, and it's a very symbiotic relationship. And so some things I think I've learned as we've tried to implement this is the importance of communication and empowering people. And I don't mean by that the usual bromides that we throw out when we talk about these things. I mean a yin and yang here. So, there's a lot of pushback against the open office movement that's happened over the last X number of years. And in many ways, I think it's been a step forward, but obviously there are downsides. And Cal Newport has a new book out on deep work, and he describes some offices that have worked and says you really need a hub and spoke architecture. You need hallways, you need common meeting areas, you need people to collaborate. But to get the deep work that these people need, they need to go into lone wolf mode occasionally and go crank out the deep thought story. You need places where people can get away and have some privacy. You also need to empower them. So you need to have meetings. You need to get that energy going, but you don't need to have a meeting about everything. Empower reporters and editors to make decisions where the benefit of having a meeting about this is going to be very low. If there's something that's not critical and not going to change much, just empower people to make some decisions and not have to call a meeting or consult with 3 supervisors. And you need to have clear benefits. This should be generating excitement and energy, and this should be about better story ideas, better serving your community, better professional development. And you want to generate those with some early wins. This is about a culture shift, not a program. This is not top-down. We're a skeptical lot as journalists, and if you want to turn us off, give us a new mandate from the top, right? So you need to start finding a coalition of the willing, tackle some big projects and show what can be done, or maybe start off with some small projects that can just show that this little tweak to a story that a lone wolf would have had, by collaborating it, you've turned it into something that's maybe an order of magnitude better and bigger for your news organization. And with that, that's it. Any questions?
Questions?
So I love the Blight series that you all did. I think it's really great. And, I like that you also talked about the impact, and you talked about how you actually got a study. It sounds like you get a third-party evaluator to talk about perception in the community, things like that. And when we try engagement, like engagement-oriented, like really, I guess, like flipping the newsroom narrative to getting the community involved first, instead of being like, here's the story, now what do you think? Looking at the actual effects of, like, on the actual revenue and business side, like, I'm curious if you looked at, like, did that boost subscriptions, or, like, in terms of, like, how engagement meets the bottom line for, like, a legacy news organization? Was that a part of the study, or did you see any benefits of that? I'm just curious if that was worked into the evaluation at all.
I have mostly anecdotal evidence. I know the newspaper sold well for both of those series, and I know the web traffic was good for both those series. But I think the most significant thing to me that stands out is that the publisher, who's kind of, as in some newsrooms, he's off in a different location, he's kind of removed, hates being removed. And I think expected to have an army of interns when we started and didn't. But whenever we talk about how it's going and what benefits they're seeing, the one thing he says is the no question, this is the biggest success we've had, and we've got to do more, are these engagement projects. That he's seen that as transformative to how his audience sees his paper, and ultimately affects their advertising perception as well as the sales in circulation.
Tim, thank you very much. Really appreciate it.